Hi everyone, we're going to look at Picots today. Picots are these little guys. They can be decorative as well as functional. Functional Picots join our elements together. To show you how to make a Picot, we're going to work a sequence of 4 Picot 4 Picot 4. It doesn't matter whether you're working a ring or a chain, Picots are worked the same way for both. Now I've set my hand up for a chain and I've worked the first 4 double stitches. Now we're going to make a Picot and work the second set of 4 double stitches. So wrap your hand as you normally would, make the first half of the next double stitch. Don't pull this loop all the way down. Secure it with the second half of the double stitch, and there is your Picot. Now we continue on and make the rest of our sequence, but we don't need 4 double stitches, we only need 3 because the first one is already there from when we made our Picot. So we have 2 sets of 4 stitches with our Picot in the middle, our first set and our second set. The second half of the last stitch in set 1 and the first half of the first stitch in set 2 is what secures our Picot. Now Picots aren't counted in a pattern because what you're actually making is 4 stitches, leaving a space and making another 4 stitches. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 Picot, 1, 2, 3, 4. To finish our sequence, we do another Picot. So the first half of the double stitch, don't pull that loop all the way down. Secure it with the second half. Finish off with our other 3 stitches, and we have 4 Picot, 4 Picot and 4. Now the size of your Picots are important. The size can determine whether your Picots are functional or decorative. Generally smaller Picots are used for joining and larger Picots are decorative, but you can have small decorative Picots just as you can have large functional Picots. So it depends on how the designer intended the pattern to be, and your own personal preference can come into it as well. So decorative Picots can vary in size throughout the pattern, but your joining Picots really need to be consistent. If they're not, you're going to have a problem with your project skewing and buckling, and it's not going to want to sit nice and flat. I like to make my joining Picots really small. Some people prefer to make the joining Picots and their decorative Picots the same size. It's up to you, so long as you are consistent throughout your design. So my samples here show the difference between a really small joining Picot and slightly larger joining Picots. All these rings have the same stitch count, but you get different looks depending on what you do with your joining Picot. So the smaller Picot, you can see, butts the 2 rings together. The one with a slightly larger Picot has a very small gap, and then again a larger Picot allows the rings to sit apart. So it doesn't matter which one you like the look of better, but consistency is key. Now, I always use a gauge. I might have a little bit of OCD, but I like the look I get from using a gauge. Now, I have heard others say they don't like using gauges because it slows them down. I really think it's what you get used to. I feel that not using a gauge slows me down because I spend more time trying to make sure that the Picot is right, whereas if I use a gauge, I know it's right and I can get on with my tatting and my OCD is happy. So at the end of the day, you really have to do what works for you. You can just eyeball your Picots if you want to. Eyeballing does take a fair bit of practice to get the consistency, but there is no reason why you can't do it that way. If you're going to use a gauge, you can buy them. This is just one particular type that's available to purchase. You can also make your own, like these ones. I made these from a plastic embroidery thread keeper. You can also use old credit cards, loyalty cards, cut them to size. You can use a toothpick if you like, as long as you're consistent with what you're using for your gauge. The way we use our gauge can be either vertically or horizontally, and again, this is personal preference. I like to use mine vertically. I find it easier and faster to use it this way. I'm going to show you how to use the gauge both ways first, and then we'll talk about the different heights in a second. So I've done my 4 double stitches. To use the gauge vertically, the gauge goes between the working thread and the shuttle thread is on top. Do the first half of your double stitch and bring that stitch up to the side of your gauge. Secure it with the second half. And there's your Picot. So again, gauge goes in between. First half right up to the side. Second half. To use our gauge horizontally, the gauge goes behind your working thread. Make your first half of your double stitch, but pull that down so it's just underneath the gauge, and secure it with the second half of your double stitch. Once more, gauge behind your working thread. First half, oops, first half, so it's just underneath your gauge. Secure it with the second half. Now, these 2 Picots were made using the same gauge. This one's vertically, this one's horizontally. So if we use the gauge vertically, then the height of our Picot is half the width of our gauge. If we use the gauge horizontally, the height of our Picot is the full width of our gauge. So if you prefer to use your gauge vertically like I do, but you want a taller picot, then you just need to use a wider gauge. The other thing I want to mention just quickly is that you don't have to take the gauge out after you've done each picot. So I'm just going to work a couple of stitches here to give us some space. So you can make your picot and work the next couple of stitches, and then just move it along when you need the next picot. Or you might have a couple of different sizes in the same sequence. You can work both of them and then take the gauges out before snugging them up. So that way you're not picking it up and putting it down all the time, but it depends on what you're comfortable doing. Moving on to picots in patterns. Here I have a written pattern and a schematic pattern. Both are telling us the same thing. In a written pattern, the dash represents picot, so the more dashes, the taller the picot. In a schematic pattern, the longer the dash, the taller the picot. So here we have a pattern of 5, 4, 4, 5. It's separated by 2 smaller picots and has 1 longer picot. This example is showing a ring of 7 picots with each picot separated by 5 double stitches. So all our picots are the same height and they're all decorative. This last one is showing that we have 2 double stitches with a joining picot followed by 5 double stitches, medium picot, 4 long decorative picot, 4 medium picot, 5 back to our joining picot, and 2. So with your pattern, you can strip decorative picots out or add more and it won't affect your pattern, but I would strongly suggest leaving your joining picots alone. If you start playing with these, it will change your whole pattern and it can alter your ring and chain position. One thing you hear me say a lot throughout my videos is that the way you decide to do something comes down to your own personal preference. By working on our projects, we discover ways of doing things that work well for us. That doesn't mean it's going to suit everybody. So much of tatting is personal preference. So I'd like to share one of my own little quirks with you. This is something I like to do. I find it makes things easier for me. Hopefully you might like it too. Now if I'm undecided on how many picots to do, what size to make them, or if I'm not sure whether the picots of one round are going to affect another round, I make small little mock-ups. So I just have a play. It only needs to be a couple of rings, maybe a ring and a chain combination, but it's enough to give me an idea and help me decide what I'm going to do. So it's a little bit of extra work. I think it saves me time in the long run because when I go to start my project, I've already looked at how things are going to connect, how it's going to work together, how this round's going to fit in with the next round. And if I work it and then decide I don't like it, or it's not sitting the way I thought it was going to be, I haven't started on my major project, so I haven't really lost anything. For this part of the video, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Erika Tashiro for giving me permission to use her Veronica pattern. This is a beautiful pattern. It's one of my favourites, and it was one of the first doilies that I made. I'm going to include the link for Erika's pattern in the description box. Now, Erika's patterns are so clear and easy to follow. What I'm about to show you really doesn't apply to this pattern, but I'm using it because it is easy to follow and the concept can be applied to any pattern. So for larger projects or any pattern that has a lot of detail, I like to separate the rounds by redrawing the pattern for each round, and I colour code my picots. So I do this if I'm finding a pattern hard to interpret. Drawing it out can really help you follow the flow of the pattern. Now some patterns are very busy, like this one. There can be a lot going on. I have pixelated this pattern to protect copyright, but you can still see that it's very busy. Stitch counts are hard to find in amongst the rest of the pattern. So by redrawing it and separating the rows, it makes it easier for me to follow where I'm up to and to see what comes next. The danger of separating and redrawing your rounds is not transferring all the information across. So if you are going to try this, triple check that you move everything across. So like the cross threads here, that's quite an important step, or your chain's going to be going the wrong way. Make sure that you transfer it onto your redraw. So Veronica has 5 rounds. I have redrawn the rounds and colour coded my picots using orange for my joining picots. So this shows me that it is a joining picot. It also shows me that I need to make a joining picot instead of a decorative picot ready for the next round. So drawing part of the previous round in green and labelling what that round is ensures I'm going to join the current round correctly. Now that might sound a little bit silly because of course round 2 joins to round 3 and then round 4, but not all the time. I have seen a pattern like this one where round 12 joined to round 11 and also to round 9. So having the rounds on there, that little bit of extra information, can really help. I used black for my decorative picots and my stitch count. Pink is the size of the joining picot. So if I'm making a ring or a clover that is in a repeat of 2 or 3 different rounds, I'd like that repeat to be the same size on each round. So by writing it down here, I know I've used a size 3 gauge, size 5 gauge. I can use that in the repeat throughout the pattern. You might be thinking it's a bit of OCD overload, but as I've said with everything in tatting, you do what works for you, and this is what I like to do with mine. Now I might not work on a project for a few days. I might have 3 or 4 going at the same time. And by having all of that information written down, I don't have to try to remember where I'm at or what gauge I have used. So I have a couple of other videos I'd like to make for you on the basics, and then I'd like to invite you to join me in making the Veronica doily. So over the next couple of weeks, if you're interested, download the pattern, decide what colours and threads you're going to use, what size you're going to make your picots, maybe even have a go at redrawing or making a couple of mock-ups if you'd like to, and we'll tat it together.